Thank you, Cindy. I wanted to express my gratitude and the gratitude of Benedictine College for the partnership with the Herzog Foundation and for making this event possible. Also wanted to thank the William S. Knight Foundation for supporting our K-12 initiatives, especially during the summer months. And I'm Kevin Vance. I direct the Center for Constitutional Liberty here at the college. Tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about the center and also offer some reflections upon what I see as the fruitful tensions in the relationship between civic, liberal, and Catholic education. But for now, the mission of the center is to promote and teach America's founding principles and also to show how those principles intersect and interact with Catholic teaching. And especially honored to welcome our guest tonight. Robert P. George holds Princeton University's celebrated McCormick Professorship of Jurisprudence. And I believe that was formerly held by President Wilson, if I remember correctly. And is founder and director of Princeton's James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. He served as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and as a presidential appointee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the U.S. President's Council on Bioethics. He's also been the U.S. member of UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. He was a judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. Phi Beta Kappa graduate at Swarthmore College. He also holds degrees from Harvard and Oxford University, in addition to 23 honorary doctorates. He's a recipient of the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal, the Honorific Medal for the Defense of Human Rights of the Republic of Poland, the Canterbury Medal of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, the Bradley Prize for Intellectual and Civic Achievement, the Gary Prize of the American Academy of Sciences and Letters, and Princeton University's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. And I also wanted to say few things about his scholarship. He's the author of, among many other things, Making Men Moral, which just celebrated its 25th anniversary this fall. And in this book, which sort of part of the inspiration for the mission of the Center for Constitutional Liberty, he offers defenses of many institutions and principles that we hold dear, like the freedom of religion and freedom of speech, but without offering defenses on the basis of either the conventional liberalism of someone like John Rawls or even the classical liberalism of someone like John Locke, but rather on the natural law tradition. I also wanted to say something about his contribution to higher education. I mentioned that he is the founding director of the James Madison Program at Princeton. This program has been the model for kind of revival in civic and a hub for liberal education all over the country. There's state programs popping up in Texas and Florida and Ohio, North Carolina, Tennessee, and probably many other places. And also on a slightly more humble scale, places like the Center for Constitutional Liberty that are also reflections on the vision the profession George had 20-something years ago. At this program, it also brings together many of America's greatest scholars at the James Madison Program. And in addition to those, there's a few postdocs that come along as well. And I had the joy and honor of being there for a year, 2017, 2018, with my family. It was one of the most wonderful, stimulating years of our lives. I also wanted to say one last thing about his teaching. Probably his greatest contribution to this country has been through many of the students. And when you meet them, it's impossible to doubt what a wonderful teacher and that Professor George is. And one quick plug, one of his students, Ryan Anderson, is going to be our Constitution Day speaker here on September 17th. So you're all welcome to come back on Constitution Day and celebrate with his student, Ryan Anderson. So it's my great honor to welcome Robert P. George.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for that beautiful and very generous introduction. I am so delighted and pleased and honored to be here, especially since I haven't kicked a field goal since I played Pop Warner football back in my little hometown in West Virginia back in the Middle Ages. President Minnis, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I want to congratulate you on everything you've done to build Benedictine into such a powerhouse. And of course, this occasion is just one of many that reflect President Minnis's vision, not only for this particular institution, but for Catholic higher education more broadly, and you really are setting the example and the standard. Sadie, I was deeply, that was deeply moved by your words, and then struck when you identified them as Charles Malick's words. I'm an enormous admirer of the late Charles Malick. I don't even know if that's a name that young people today would recognize. The great Lebanese statesman of the mid-20th century, one of the architects of the great UN Declaration on Human Rights of 1948, arguing from a natural law foundation, what I would then go on to do, really simply following out the logic of Malick in making men moral. I have the pleasure of being a friend of Malick's son, Habib Malick, who is now just retiring from teaching in the university in Beirut. So it's just marvelous to hear his name invoked. And of course, those were very, very powerful words indeed, Sadie. So grateful to the Herzog Foundation for supporting this effort. And of course, enormously grateful to my dear friend, Kevin Vance. We were very honored, President Menace, to have the Vances with us in the Madison program. And I know what a wonderful job he's doing out here. Did you give that boy a raise? Did I say that the way you told me to, Kevin? Yeah. But if you make these kinds of hires going forward, you're going to be golden, absolutely golden. Well, what should we Catholics in our homes and schools and universities be teaching our children and our students about the United States of America and about their rights and responsibilities as citizens? Now, of course, American Catholics have faced that question from the time of the American founding. Most Catholic citizens over the decades and now centuries, and most Catholic leaders, including our bishops and clergy, have affirmed the American Republic and endorsed its founding principles and constitutional structures. Most have treated Protestant and now secular progressive concerns about the ability of faithful Catholics to be loyal Americans as rooted in bigotry, or, more charitably, as reflecting a misunderstanding of Catholicism and of American ideals and institutions. But there have always been and are today some Catholics, including American Catholics, who shared and share this belief that good Catholics cannot unreservedly affirm the principles of the American Republic, a republic that they view as defective from a faithfully Catholic vantage point. Now, we have in America a separation of church and state. The phrase itself does not appear in the Constitution, and the nature of the separation is wildly misunderstood by many people, especially among secular progressives today. But we do have a regime in which the church and the state are separated institutionally. And so, for example, no one in America holds political office in virtue of an ecclesiastical appointment, and no one holds ecclesiastical office in virtue of political preferment. What's more, we have a constitutionally protected freedom of religion. The First Amendment to our Constitution states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Constitution also protects religious liberty by prohibiting religious tests for public office. People are free to be and may not be discriminated against by government for being Catholic, but people are equally free to be and protected from discrimination for being Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, agnostic, atheist, or anything else. And of course, the United States of America is a democratic republic. We resolve our differences of opinion in the broad realm of politics, ultimately by voting. We have an elaborate system, but it's a democratic republic. Now, none of what I have just described is a problem for most Catholics today, nor has it been a problem for most Catholics in earlier generations. Whatever concerns about them or prejudices against them other Americans might have had or have today. But there have been, as I say, and are today, some Catholics who view the separation of church and state, religious freedom, and indeed democracy as, at a minimum, less than ideal. They believe that in a fully just state, in an ideal state, the true faith, the Catholic faith, would be constitutionally recognized as such, and the true church, the Catholic Church, would be the established religion. Furthermore, in an ideal state, the spreading of religious falsehoods, that is, ideas that are in conflict with the teachings of the Catholic Church, would be forbidden. And they say that in such a state, we would not ultimately resolve our political disagreements by allowing everyone, or everyone who had attained a certain age, to vote. Now, Catholics who share these concerns recall the teachings of 19th century popes expressing skepticism, to put it mildly, about the separation of church and state, freedom of religion, and democracy. These popes warned that separation of church and state and the freedom of religion would have the effect of encouraging religious skepticism or indifferentism and creating an environment inhospitable to the gospel and to the work of evangelization. They were concerned that democracy would lead people to believe that right and wrong, truth and falsehood, were to be determined and perhaps even established by voting, and therefore lack the objectivity they have always been claimed to have by the Catholic Church. Now, contemporary Catholic critics of American ideals and institutions fear that the worries and concerns of those 19th century popes have proven to be fully justified. They look at a contemporary landscape in which religious indifferentism and skepticism and moral subjectivism and relativism are flourishing, and faith is foundering. And they say, see, the old popes were right. They sound a bit there like Mallet, don't they? Now, of course, the contemporary magisterium of the Catholic Church expresses no objection to the separation of church and state, understood as I described it earlier, in contrast to the understanding promoted by secular progressives today. And the Church positively affirms the right to religious liberty and the legitimacy, even the desirability of democracy. So how do Catholic critics of these ideas come to terms with that? Well, some believe that recent popes, beginning with Pope St. John the 23rd, have simply taken the Church down the wrong path. They think, for example, that the great Declaration on Religious Freedom of the Second Vatican Council, Dignitatis Humanae, affirming a robust view of religious freedom, one that embraces the right of people to promote their beliefs about religious questions, even when they are in error, was a grave mistake and should be abrogated. Some, of course, think that the whole council was a mistake. Similarly, they think that Pope St. John Paul II's global advocacy of democracy and his endorsement of the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States during his visits to our country were misguided. Now, how should we, especially we as educators and we as parents, think about all this? That's just another way of asking the question with which I began. What should we as Catholic parents and teachers be teaching our young people about the United States of America and their role as citizens of this nation? Perhaps the place to begin is with those 19th century popes, men like Pope Gregory XVI and Blessed Pius IX. The critics often point to the teachings of these men, good and holy men, who tried their best to steward the Church during periods of intense political instability in Europe, to illustrate what they claim to be discontinuities between the larger Catholic tradition and the teaching of the Church in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, as expressed, for example, in Dignitatis Humanae, and again in the other conciliar documents, and the teachings of the post-conciliar popes, of especially John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Now, some of these critics go so far as to say that the teachings of these preconciliar popes represent an indictment of the entire American project, inasmuch as American ideals and institutions are intertwined with allegedly liberal, modernist, or indifferentist political ideas such as freedom of religion and democracy. If the critics are right that the preconciliar popes condemned ideas like democracy and religion wholesale, that would seem to pose a problem for Catholic parents seeking to teach their children to be responsible citizens and to respect our country's foundational documents, most importantly, the Constitution. But are the critics right? Is the American project fundamentally irreconcilable with traditional Catholic political and social doctrine? Well, leaving aside the point that from the perspective of the Catholic faith, the teaching authority of an ecumenical council such as Vatican II is superior to the non-ex cathedra teachings of an individual pope, something that would resolve the matter in the event that there were a contradiction, we might consider whether such a contradiction in fact exists. And we do that by, I think, charitably examining what those preconciliar popes actually taught, and crucially, by situating their words within their proper historical and rhetorical context. In Gregory XVI's 1832 encyclical letter, Mirari Vos, on the subject of liberalism and religious indifferentism, the Pope decried the, quote, perverse opinion, unquote, that, quote, it is possible to obtain the eternal salvation of the soul by the profession of any kind of religion so long as morality is maintained, unquote. Pope Gregory wrote that such a, quote, shameful font of indifferentism gives rise to that absurd and erroneous proposition which claims that liberty of conscience must be maintained for everyone, unquote, through means such as the freedom of the press and what he described as the, quote, license of free speech, unquote. These ideas, Pope Gregory argued, were promoted by, quote, shameless lovers of liberty, unquote, whose unbridled lust for freedom, as he put it, also compelled them to, quote, break the mutual concord between temporal authority and the priesthood, to seek, in other words, a subjugation of the church by the state. In a similar vein, in his 1864 encyclical Quanta Cura, Gregory's successor, Pope Blessed Pius IX, decried the notion that, quote, liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right, which ought to be legally proclaimed and asserted in every rightly constituted society, and that a right resides in the citizens to an absolute liberty which should be constrained by no authority, whether ecclesiastical or civil, whereby they may be able openly and publicly to manifest and declare any of their ideas, whatever, either by word of mouth or by the press or in any other way, unquote. In an attached document, the famous Syllabus of Errors, Pope Pius bluntly condemned the proposition that, quote, the Roman pontiff can and ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization, unquote. Here we must first acknowledge the historical context in which Popes Gregory and Pius wrote. At the front of their minds, and at the front of the minds of the entirety of the Church's leadership, which was during this period, of course, overwhelmingly European, was, of course, the French Revolution, along with all the political and religious and cultural and social consequences that ideas associated with French revolutionary ideology were continuing to inflict in European countries where the Church's hierarchy had once enjoyed immense political influence. It's not an exaggeration, I think, to say that the 19th century Catholic Church was under attack by radical ideologies, including skepticism, religious indifferentism, moral relativism, subjectivism, extreme anti-clericalism, demands for liberation from traditional moral constraints, and demands for the subjugation of the Church by the state. In France, the revolution at the conclusion of the 18th century had seen the widespread suppression and violent subjugation of churches and monasteries, as well as the martyring of priests, consecrated religious, and faithful Catholic laymen who refused to swear to the civil constitution of the clergy or otherwise adhere to the revolutionary government's rabidly anti-clerical and Rousseauian religious policies. The revolution's effects did not stop with the fall of the revolutionary government. In the decades following, the doctrines of French revolutionary ideology continued to fester within the church, and both Gregory and Pius were forced to contend with the prominent French Catholics among both the clergy and the laity, who publicly and persistently argued that French revolutionary principles were reconcilable with Catholic doctrine. We learned earlier this week that not much has changed in France. The predominant ideology of the French Revolution was, of course, Jacobinism, what Father John Courtney Murray, S.J., the American Jesuit, commonly acknowledged to have shaped the development of the Church's teaching on religious freedom at the Second Vatican Council. Termed, I love this characterization, it's exactly right, sectarian liberalism. Its cardinal thesis was the primacy of the political, quote, everything within the state, nothing above the state. That's the slogan, unquote. For the Jacobins, the only place for the church was under the state. In other words, the church must be subjugated to serve the needs of the state. That is precisely what they sought to do with the civil constitution of the clergy, which essentially created a department of church, whose clergy owed their ultimate fidelity to the revolutionary government, as well as through their various innovations to try to eliminate the institutional church altogether, replace it with the cult of reason, the infamous cult of the supreme being. You see something similar, of course, in communist China. The Jacobin revolutionaries were eager students of Rousseau and his conception of civil religion. It was within the purview of the state to determine how, when, and where, and what of permissible religious worship and the participation of citizens. Remember, this is the historical context in which those pre-conciliar popes wrote, and this is undoubtedly the context in which their thinking was shaped. Jacobinism and its associated ideologies were what contemporary popes predominantly had in mind when they decried progress and liberalism. It was this system, not the tenets later prescribed in Dignitatis Humanae, which I'll explain just a bit, that the church's leaders were pushing back against when they denounced separation of church and state and religious liberty. Indeed, the opinion that Gregory XVI condemned as perverse in 1832, the notion, rooted in a sectarian liberal understanding of freedom of conscience, that, quote, it is possible to obtain the eternal salvation of the soul by the profession of any kind of religion, is bread and butter religious indifferentism, and is something certainly not affirmed by Dignitatis Humanae in its defense of religious freedom. Quite the opposite. Dignitatis Humanae strongly opposes indifferentism in its affirmation of the eternal truth that there is one true religion, which subsists, I quote, in the Catholic and Apostolic Church, to which the Lord Jesus committed the duty of spreading it abroad among men, unquote. Dignitatis Humanae rejects understandings of religious freedom that are grounded in the view that all religions are equally true or equally untrue, or in the view that religious truth is purely a subjective matter. It rejects the Rousseauian and Rawlsian politically prudential account of religious freedom that hinges on the idea that religious freedom is a necessary means for maintaining social peace and stability in the face of entrenched religious pluralism. Dignitatis Humanae also rejects the liberal view, the sectarian liberal view, that religious liberty is an abstract right grounded in personal autonomy, or a concept of fairness floating free of any considerations of the human good. These arguments all incline, to various degrees, towards some form of public and governmental agnosticism, what in academic political theory is often described as anti-perfectionism, on the question of the human good, those aspects of human well-being and fulfillment that are constitutive of the integral flourishing of human persons. But by contrast with that sectarian liberal conception, Dignitatis Humanae grounds the importance of, and indeed the right to, religious liberty in the role it plays in enabling and facilitating the sincere and earnest truth-seeking in religious matters that all persons are called to, bound to, required to, from the moral point of view, from the spiritual point of view, undertake, insofar as the pursuit of religious truth and the conformity of one's life to the precepts of religious truth once it is discovered, constitutes a unique and fundamental aspect of human flourishing. The Declaration pairs its acknowledgement of objective religious truth, its affirmation that all men are bound to seek the truth, especially in what concerns God and His church, and to embrace the truth when they come to know it and to hold fast to it, quoting, with the explicit knowledge. It's paired with the explicit acknowledgement that, and again I quote, the truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth, as it makes its entrance into the mind at once quietly and with power, unquote. Dignitatis Humanae teaches that, quote, as the truth is discovered, it is by a personal assent, I interject, an act of the intellect and will, stop, back to quoting, that men are to adhere to it. As the truth is discovered, it is by a personal assent that men are to adhere to it. This wise and philosophically sound defense of religious freedom, as articulated in Dignitatis Humanae, is one that is entirely consistent with the patrimony of the Church's teaching. It has never been condemned by popes, not by the 18th or 19th century popes. It does not appeal, explicitly or implicitly, to any form of religious indifferentism, relativism, subjectivism, or to the instrumentalization of religion to political purposes. It is not, quote, religious freedom of the Rawlsian anti-perfectionist liberal sort, grounded in philosophies of abstract right or what Rawls calls justice as fairness. Serious Catholics would be correct in rejecting any defense of religious freedom grounded in those kinds of sectarian liberal, and from the Catholic point of view, certainly from my point of view, dubious ideas. The right of religious freedom recognized by Dignitatis Humanae is grounded in the intrinsic value of religious truth-seeking, considered as a fundamental aspect of our flourishing as human beings. The nature of that value is such that it cannot be realized or well served by external coercive imposition by the civil state or any other authority. Again, quote the Declaration, the truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its truth. Any attempt by the state to coerce religious faith and practice, even true faith and practice, will at best be futile and would likely damage people's authentic participation in the good of religion. Indeed, the coercion can only serve to impair or impede the possibility of authentic religious faith necessary for authentic realization of a fundamental aspect of human flourishing, because it damages free and sincere religious discernment by hijacking the person's interior deliberations with completely different concerns, those of freedom from physical harm or pain or material loss, or of freedom from some other non-religious disadvantage, for example, a ban on voting or holding civil office or being employed by the government leveled against non-believers. For the Catholic, finding and maintaining communion with the Lord Jesus Christ, the saints in heaven, and His church on earth, is analogous to communion with our fellow human beings in authentic friendship in its reflexivity. Let me say what I mean by its reflexivity. It cannot constitute authentic communion unless it represents a free self-giving, unless it is the fruit of a free choice to enter into the relationship. You can't have a coerced friendship. I, as daddy, might say, David, you need to be friends with Joey. But if I try to force that friendship, it's not going to be, I can encourage, I can exhort, but if I try to force that friendship, whatever it will be, even if it has the external indicia of friendship, it's not going to be a friendship. You can only enter into a friendship by an interior act of intellect and will. In that sense, friendship is an example, as is religion, of a reflexive good. An innocent person's confession under torture would be no confession at all, similarly. So too would an outward profession of religious faith, even a profession of true religious faith, not be true faith if it issued from conditions of coercion. Religious freedom, however, is certainly, of course, not absolute. Dignitatis Humanae notes that religious communities rightfully claim freedom only so long as the just demands of public order are observed. So governments may legitimately restrict people's freedom, even when it touches upon their religious practice, as our own government does, perfectly legitimately, when failure to do so would imperil central elements of the common good. For instance, if a Neo-Aztec cult, sincere, let's assume they're sincere, a Neo-Aztec cult wanted to practice human sacrifice, even if it was supposedly consensual, where the victims agree to be sacrificed, to please, let's say, the sun god, the government could, and surely would, prohibit the practice and would legitimately do so without violating the principles of Dignitatis Humanae. This is true even when those acts are asserted by adherents to be religiously required, and even where the restriction implies or entails that religious propositions which gave rise to the common good imperiling act are false. For example, even if the Neo-Aztec cult claimed to believe that regular human sacrifices were required to satisfy the sun god's bloodlust and prevent him from destroying the whole area. So, as Dignitatis Humanae teaches, society has the right to defend itself against possible abuses committed on the pretext of freedom of religion. It's with this principle that we can dispatch, for example, contemporary progressive claims that certain religions require the killing of unborn children via abortion, and that abortion access is thus a matter of religious freedom. You're going to hear that more and more often. There are already cases pending in the federal courts. It's also true with what superficially might seem to be a muddier religious freedom claim. A liberal mainline Protestant denomination's argument, for example, that their revisionist beliefs about marriage, same-sex marriage and so forth, mean that the law must redefine marriage to include unions other than those between one man and one woman. For example, they might claim that any relationship that doesn't do immediate palpable harm to others has to be recognized, as a marriage by the state for the sake of religious freedom. Now, of course, it may be asserted, perhaps by the critics, that the understanding of religious freedom I have just outlined marks a fundamental shift in Catholic thinking and teaching away from the responsibility of the state to promote all aspects of the common good, of which individual citizens maintaining right religion and a right relationship with God would be a significant part. But such an objection, I believe, misses the point. The state, the government, if it's doing what Dignitatis Humanae requires, is promoting the common good. It's creating the conditions in which human flourishing is possible, especially in respect of this vitally important good of religious faith. Under the guidelines presented by Dignitatis Humanae, the state, recognizing the value of religion as a fundamental aspect of human flourishing, as well as the crucial importance of religion to the common good, may indeed and should actively promote religion, religious practice, and the place of religious values in the public square. That's all in Dignitatis Humanae too. Some of its Catholic critics seem not to read that part, but it's right there on the page. And it does this in part, and perhaps above all, by respecting and protecting religious freedom, including the full and generous recognition of the freedom of the Catholic Church, as our Constitution does. Moreover, it may foster and promote religion by providing for the protection and accommodation of its free exercise, once again, as our Constitution rightly interpreted does. Now, we have to here be careful not to identify our Constitution with the judicial rulings of the Supreme Court of the United States between 1947 and roughly yesterday. The Supreme Court, and I have various writings on this, as do many other scholars, the Supreme Court of the United States took a terrible wrong turn in 1947. And it went through the 60s, through the Warren Court period, and it endured well into the 2000s. And we finally have a court that is undoing all the damage. The Constitution, properly understood, does not establish sectarian liberalism as the state religion, which is what the Warren Court tried to do. Rather, it recognizes the value of a robust conception of religious freedom precisely in line with what Dignitatis Humanae articulates. So there's no evidence to suggest, with respect to our Constitution, that the popes of the 18th and 19th centuries had much knowledge of its structure or the valid purposes of its protection of civil liberties, not just freedom of religion, but freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances or so forth of the political system in the United States. They weren't very focused on America. It was a provincial place. They were much more focused on Europe and, of course, the legacy of the French Revolution. When a 19th century pope heard the phrase religious freedom, you can bet what he had in mind was French revolutionary ideological ideas of religious freedom. Ditto for democracy. Ditto for separation of church and state. So the popes didn't focus in a way, didn't have the understanding to see that the First Amendment of our Constitution's prohibition on sectarian religious establishments, or its enshrinement of a strictly institutional separation of church and state, and the robust protection of free exercise of religion for all purposes, were really distinct from French Revolutionary-style religious indifferentism, state secularism, and moral relativism. As Europeans, shaped by a particular historical experience and in many ways shielded from the rest of the world, the first, as far as the shielding is concerned, one of my research assistants came up with this fact that I didn't know. The first pope in centuries to step outside of Europe was Pope Paul VI in 1964. You know? So they tended to understand the idea of religious freedom when they heard those words as the French revolutionary ideological idea. They didn't bring clearly into focus features that distinguish it from the very different conception of religious freedom developed largely by British and American thinkers, manifested to significant degrees in the words and deeds of the American founders, and developed in the Church's teaching through Dignitatis Humanae and the Second Vatican Council. If you read James Madison, for example, on religious freedom, the freedom to fulfill our duty to the Creator, you'll see that it's a very different conception than the Jacobins. Well, what about the other four of the five freedoms protected by our First Amendment? What do we tell our children about freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly, and the right to petition the government? Well, we must note that Dignitatis Humanae teaches that, quote, religious communities rightfully claim freedom in order that they may govern themselves according to their own norms, honor the Supreme Being in public worship, assist their members in the practice of religious life, strengthen them by instruction, and promote institutions in which they may join together for the purpose of ordering their own lives in accordance with their religious principles, unquote. The Declaration further professes that religious communities, quote, also have the right not to be hindered in their public teaching and witness to their faith, whether by the spoken or the written word, unquote. What we can say is that the precise laws regulating speech, the press, and assembly that a Catholic is called to support remains in large part a matter of prudential judgment so long as the rights of everyone, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, are respected. And of course, contemporary progressive conceptions of free speech, Warren Court conceptions of free speech, as protecting libertine excesses such as pornography and obscenity, must be rejected as not only not protected speech, just as defamation, deliberate incitement to imminent violence, and false advertising are forms of expression unprotected by the First Amendment right to free speech, but particularly in the case of pornography, a dreadful plague that is doing enormous damage to our children, girls now as well as boys. It is clearly the state's responsibility to push back and fight back against it. Still, there's nothing within the Church's magisterium that condemns or rejects the freedoms protected by the First Amendment properly understood, and understood here in the United States itself prior to the Warren Court era, when, for example, for the first time, pornography began to be treated by liberal judges as protected free speech. In fact, prior to that, quite the contrary was true. The conditions of religious freedom called for by Dignitatis Humanae would seem to be served well by robust protections of free speech, free press, and the right to peaceably assembled, again, properly understood. The truth is that our Constitution and our founding documents are not grounded in relativistic or subjectivist principles or modern progressive innovations such as abstract right or justice as fairness. The Declaration of Independence famously proclaimed that there are certain self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The Constitution, while admittedly not citing a precise philosophical grounding for the free exercise of religion it defends, certainly does not ground or sustain its free exercise protections in French revolutionary doctrines condemned by ministerial authority in the 19th century. Indeed, a responsible and charitable interpretation of our Constitution, such as that offered by John Courtney Murray, would not result in one's concluding that the rights it protects are somehow incompatible or irreconcilable with Catholic doctrine. The strong pronouncements of Gregory XVI and Pius IX were well considered and represented as forceful attempts to confront the challenges of largely European church, challenges that they were facing at the time, but they included no condemnations fairly applicable to the American Constitution or Declaration of Independence or our nation's founding principles, which is why they could, all of those things, the Constitution, the Declaration, the founding principles of the nation, could so robustly be affirmed. The Pope even congratulated us on it in the visits of Pope John Paul II. I should add, similar statements were made by Mother Teresa, not of the same magisterial authority, but a formidable woman worth listening to. I once had the honor in one of the early efforts to try to overturn Roe versus Wade. I had the honor of representing Mother on an amicus curiae brief before the Supreme Court, and for most of the brief, my co-counsel and I, on her behalf, articulated and re-articulated the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And what Mother, in that brief and in her, you may recall her famous prayer breakfast speech with the Clintons and the Gores sitting on either side of her when she made her profound pro-life witness, Mother there, too, demanded what she said was, she didn't say, America, your principles are bad, you need new principles. America, your principles are bad. You should go back to the 19th century and revisit those things. No, what did Mother call us to do? Be true to your principles. Here's your problem with things like abortion. You're being untrue to your principles. Your Constitution says all men are created equal. That means every single member of the human family is the bearer of profound, inherent, and equal dignity, beginning with the precious child in the womb. Be true to your principles. We should also note, again, that since the conclusion of Vatican II, there have been many papal endorsements of our founding documents, and certainly no pronouncements that, for example, the free exercise of religion under the First Amendment is in any way out of alignment with the Church's teaching on religious freedom and the civil state's duty to protect it. Pope John Paul II was particularly effusive in his praise for what he described as, quote, the American democratic experiment. He noted that, and I quote him again, in reading the founding documents of your country, one has to be impressed by the concept of freedom they enshrine, a freedom designed to enable people to fulfill their duties and responsibilities toward the family and toward the common good of the community, unquote. Again, it's just like Mother. He's calling us to be faithful. Your problem is not you got the wrong principles. Your problem is you're not being faithful to your principles. We need to tell our children, let's be faithful to our principles. These are good and sound and true principles. Our problem is not our principles. Our problem is so often we are unfaithful to them. John Paul the Great commended our founding fathers for asserting their claims to freedom and independence on the basis of self-evident truths about the human person, not on the basis of any unbridled lust for freedom, to quote Gregory XVI, who is, of course, here referring to French revolutionary ideology. The concept of freedom John Paul recognized, and that our Constitution and our democratic system rightly affirm, is not freedom as license. It's not freedom for freedom's sake. It's not if it feels good, do it. It's not do whatever you please. To the contrary, John Paul the Great noted that our founding fathers, and I'm going to quote him again, clearly understood that there could be no true freedom without moral responsibility and accountability, unquote. Indeed, true freedom is not freedom understood as liberation from supposedly outdated and oppressive moral constraints, Or, to paraphrase my teacher Joseph Raz from Oxford, freedom understood as enabling a person to become maximally autonomous as the author of his own life. It is rather the freedom to choose the good, to engage in morally worthy choosing and pursue human goods in the particular ways God calls us to pursue them. Freedom of religion creates the instrumentally necessary conditions that enable us to participate in the good of religion and pursue religious truth, and with God's grace, arrive at its fullness in the Catholic faith. Freedom of speech, assembly, and petition are similarly conditions and tools that enable us to pursue truth and proclaim and promote it in the public square. It is in this spirit that I again here at the end return to the question with which I began. What should we as Catholic parents and teachers be teaching our children about our country and their role as citizens? The answer, it seems to me, is clear. We must teach our children to respect and cherish our country's history, our founding principles, our democratic system, and the values for which the United States of America, in its origin and at its best, stands. We should teach them to value our Constitution, to value its defense of civil liberties, not merely because it protects those freedoms, but because the freedoms it protects are freedoms that allow us to nurture and sustain our families, our communities, our country's civic order. And we must affirm to our children and to our students that there is no reason at all that they should feel as though they must choose between, on the one hand, being a faithful Catholic, and on the other, being a patriotic American. Those who would present our young people with such a choice present a false choice, a false dilemma, one that is unsupported by the Church's teaching. Now, of course, the Church does not teach that democracy is always required or that it is the highest or best form of government. The Church does not make judgments that there is a single, uniquely best form of government, save for the emphatic rejection of totalitarian political systems such as fascism and communism. But democracy, democratic Republican government, at its best, does give expression, perhaps unique expression, to the principle of equal human dignity that the Church always and everywhere proclaims. As John Paul noted, the continuing success of the American experiment depends on the degree to which each new generation, native-born and immigrant, makes its own the moral truths on which the Founding Fathers staked the future of this country. So we must continuously pray, work for the health and strength of our democratic republic, for laws and policies and leaders that truly honor that North Star principle, what I call the principle of all sound morality, the principle of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. Friends, let me leave you with this final call to action, one I personally find inspiring by John Paul II from a homily he delivered in Baltimore during his visit to the United States in 1995. Here's what he says: Catholics of America, always be guided by truth, by the truth about God who created and redeemed us, and by the truth about the human person made in his image and likeness, and destined for a glorious fulfillment in the kingdom to come. Always be convincing witnesses to the truth. Stir into flame the gift of God that has been bestowed upon you in baptism. Light your nation, light the world with the power of that flame. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Okay, Professor George has agreed to take questions, and we have about 15 to 18 minutes for that. And Paul Burkhardt is going to hear the microphone.
Thank you, Dr. George, for your eloquent defense of freedom of religion. One of my parents at my school is from Spain, and he talks about the pernicious effects of the state not allowing the freedom of religion in Spain. My question is about your distinction between Rawlsian sectarian liberalism and American constitutional thought. It would seem to one could support religious freedom while still saying, well, the state still has to shepherd its people in some way. And pornography seems to be a great example of that. On what basis does the state say this is not for the public good, other than referencing a higher moral claim, a religion, an established authority, the church?
So, thank you, Jonathan. So what's the central principle of government action? Why do we have a government? Why do we have a state? What's the point? What's its purpose? What's its justifying goal? It's to advance the common good. It does that by protecting public health, safety, and morals, protecting individual rights, preventing predation of citizens by other citizens, and so forth. And as our founding fathers said, if you read the Federalist Papers, you'll find this line: the first duty of government is to control the governed. The second is to govern itself, to control itself, because the government can become the predator. So the very same reason that the government should protect religious freedom is the reason the government should combat pornography with all prudential means. Now, you can never act even for a good end by bad means. And prudential judgment, careful prudential judgment is always required, because there are dangers to censorship. There's no question that there are. So you're going to have to tolerate a certain amount of evil for the sake of avoiding a worse catastrophe. But tolerating a certain amount is not just a wholesale license for the government to abdicate its responsibility to the common good to protect especially and particularly our young people from a plague, a curse like pornography. We're no longer in this is not 1948. This is not 1961. This is not 1970. We're no longer in any doubt about the damage pornography does. There was a time when people who at least seemed like perfectly reasonable people would say, well, what's pornography? It's a harmless vice. It's a naughty fun. We now know better. We know about its psychological impact. We know what it does to men, and we're learning now what it does to women, especially when children become addicted to pornography at young ages. And it's happening to girls as well as boys. So it's obviously then the government's responsibility, since it's bound to pursue the common good, to try to fight against that evil in the same way that it would fight in the domain of economics against oligopolistic or monopolistic practices. Those too, in a certain sense, restrain freedom, but they do so for the sake of legitimate goals, for the sake of advancing and preserving the common good. So this is why we should reject, and in my book, Making Men Moral, I give my reasons for rejecting Rawlsian anti-perfectionism. And all that means is the position famously articulated and defended by the great liberal political philosopher, modern liberal political philosopher John Rawls, that government action should never be based on any controversial conception of what makes for or detracts from a valuable and morally worthy way of life. That position of neutrality toward the common good, or toward the human good, is not only undesirable, it's impossible. And I myself and other critics of Rawls, I think it's fair to say, have shown that Rawls himself can't sustain it without smuggling into his theory the very thing his theory formally excludes, that is, controversial conceptions of what makes for or detracts from a valuable and morally worthy way of life. So we're going to have to think about the common good by thinking about the human good. We're going to have to recognize that the kinds of freedoms that do deserve protection, those Bill of Rights civil liberties, deserve it because they serve and protect the human good. And for the same reasons, we do things like act against monopolistic or oligopolistic practices in the economic sphere and against things like pornography in the social sphere.
Thank you, Dr. George, for your talk. I've looked up to you for the last probably 10 years and your work. So thank you for your work that you do. One question I have is about the common good. I know that with the common good, it's the responsibility of the state to promote the flourishing of the human individual and to prevent evil from happening to that individual, right? As Thomas Aquinas would say, natural law. But my question is, why couldn't it be in the best interest of the human person that they become Catholic, for example? And so why should not the state promote Catholicism? Because that is the final end of man.
Yeah, okay. So it is for the human good that people become Catholic. If the Catholic Church teaches truly, then it's in everybody's interest to know the truth. The more truth you got, the more fulfillment. Now, at the same time, in a companion document to the document Dignitatis Humanae, the document Nostra Aetate, which is famous for one thing, which is its repudiation of anti-Semitism and the charge of deicide against the Jewish people, and its affirmation of the Jewish people as in a continuing and unbroken covenant with God. That's the part it's famous for. But beyond that, of course, it goes through the Church's relationship with all the non-Christian religions, and positively and explicitly affirms that we as Catholics do affirm all that is true and holy, all that is good in the other religions. It's not that there is no good in those other religions, but we as Catholics believe that the fullness of religious truth subsists in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So we'd love everybody to get there. But we recognize that there is some fulfillment in good religious practices, even outside of the specifically Catholic context. And we don't want to override those, right? The other thing is, for someone to become a Catholic under coercion is to harm them. It's not to help them. So what the Church objects to in Dignitatis Humanae is forcing people who haven't made the interior act of the will and intellect to act as though they're Catholic. What it doesn't rule out is an established church, and nothing that I said rules out an established church. It doesn't require an established church. And there are very good reasons not to require an established church. Can do a lot more harm than good. And if you see, even in states where Catholicism has been established, the record in the long run is not good. So I think we have reason to be suspicious, or careful at least, even in circumstances where we could establish the church as the state church. But it's not ruled out by the council.
Yeah, thank you. So just to clarify, so it's within the interests of the U.S. citizens to promote the human good, like the common good known by reason. But why can we promote that, but not the highest good, that is Catholicism, or the highest, I would guess, revealed religion that is true as Catholic?
I think we're in heated agreement. Yeah. Now the question is how you do that, and do you do that by privileging the Catholic Church, or do you do that by creating a playing field on which the Church can vie for the allegiance of citizens on fair terms of discourse with everybody else, and people can, through the force of reason, the power of argument, if we're doing our job in evangelization correctly, come to a fully free and therefore fully fulfilling affirmation of the faith. Yeah, you want to come on?
Yeah. Sorry, I could talk to you all day. I don't mean to take up all this, but so yes, so no, that's so coercion, right? So when I take my child to baptize him, that child has no, he's not using his capacity to reason to make that or to assent to that, right? So how is that? But I'm doing that because I'm setting the conditions by which he can flourish. So why can't the state do that?
Because adult citizens aren't children. And it's wrong to infantilize them. It's wrong to treat them. You would not want Joe Biden treating you as a child, believe me. And it may get worse in a few months.
Does it?
So, you know, we treat grown-ups as human beings, as rational creatures, possessed of agency, of freedom and reason. And we make our arguments. I mean, the duty of evangelization doesn't just fall on the bishops. It falls on all of us, and it certainly doesn't fall in any primary sense on the government. Too often, people who want to put religion into the hands of the government want to basically abdicate their own responsibilities for evangelization. It's up to us. Why should we ask for anything more as Catholics than a fair playing field to go out there among our fellow citizens and make the argument for the Catholic faith? I'll take that deal any day. You have a point over here.
Thank you, Professor George. So I live in Michigan, and with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, I think a lot of us were ecstatic, and then Prop 3 happened, which ingrained abortion in state law. So I work at a high school. We obviously pray, which is most important. What suggestions or advocacy would you say for, especially for teenagers, of overturning the on-demand abortion laws that we have now ingrained in our constitutions, our state constitutions, and what are your suggestions for that from a legal standpoint or from just a moral standpoint?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't have been so surprised. I was, so I'm guilty here. I'm not accusing other people of this and not myself. I'm accusing myself of this too. We should have been readier than we were for the blowback, the backlash after Roe fell. After all, I mean, I actually, of all people, should probably feel the most guilty because I wrote a whole book, the book that Kevin kindly mentioned, Making Men Moral, 30 years ago now, actually. I wrote a whole book that was basically reminding people that the law is a teacher, that whatever else law does, law educates. It has a pedagogical function. It shapes people's understandings. It shapes their sensibilities. Well, for 49 years, 5 months, and 2 days, our law taught people that abortion is a fundamental woman's right, that the child in the womb is nothing more than a clump of undifferentiated mass of material. And should we be surprised that people came to believe that under those circumstances? And so when this right to abortion suddenly disappeared, they felt as though some grave wrong had been done to them, some grave injustice. So we didn't do as good a job as we should have done in public education. But that doesn't mean that we can't do it now. And especially with respect to our young people, I think we need to inspire them with the nobility of the cause. Here should be our constant refrain to young people. At the heart of our mission is protecting the principle, what I described in my formal remarks is the principle of all morality, the principle of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. We should be saying to our young people, this is an either or. There's no shades of gray here. You either believe it or you don't. Do you believe in equal human dignity or do you not? If you don't, okay, we're going to have a different conversation, and we're going to then have to decide who's in and who's out. Black people in, black people out. Muslims in, Muslims out. Disabled people in, disabled people out. Newborn infants in, newborn peoples out. Unborn children in or out. But if you believe, as we do and as our church proclaims, that it's true that each and every member of the human family is a bearer of profound, inherent, and equal dignity, then the question of who should be protected by the law is settled, and the only question is how are we going to go about doing it? And I think we need to tell our young people that every single one of them has some duty to be in this struggle, just as every single American had some level of duty to be in the struggle for civil rights and to abolish slavery. Not all are called to exactly the same vocation. Not all are called to the political realm. For some, it may be simply that they're called to be in prayer. But we all have a role to play in this great struggle, because it's that core principle on which everything else depends that's at stake. So there's nobody who doesn't have the skills or doesn't have the specialty or doesn't have the calling or doesn't have the vocation to be in the struggle. Everybody's got to be in the struggle. And I think the fact that it's hard and that most people today, the majority are against us, should be the thing that we use to inspire our young people. They don't want easy causes. They want hard ones. We are in so much better shape today in the pro-life movement than the anti-slavery movement was in 1855. We really are. We've got much more public support for pro-life laws than abolitionists had for the abolition of slavery. So let's not, be all down at the mouth and woe is me and we can't win and there's no hope. Now, we hope we can do this without a civil war, of course. But, all noble causes have their moments when we think the people are so corrupt and they're so misguided and they're so heavily bought into the evil that there's no way out of it, and we can't yield to that. But
big pressure, Kevin. How would you explain the idea of goodwill to high school kids when society uses the idea of goodwill for transgenderism, puberty blockers, vaccine mandates, all these? They say it's for the goodwill of those people, and high school kids are pretty black and white sometimes. So how would you articulate how you're talking about goodwill versus how society and the media sometimes uses the idea of goodwill?
Historical examples. Every student you teach should be told the history of eugenics. And when you tell that history, I want you to read Thomas Leonard's book, Illiberal Reformers. Which class or classes of people were up to their eyeballs in the eugenics movement? Who led it? Who promoted it? Who condemned those who criticized it? Was it those Hicks and Rubes, those racists, those hillbillies, those working class people, those Catholics, those evangelicals? No. It was the elite. It was the affluent. It was the well-educated. It was the progressive. It was the professoriate at Princeton and Yale and Harvard. They don't want to remember that now. They want to recall their glory days in the civil rights movement. Ask them about eugenics and who stood up against it, at the risk of being called enemies of science, enemies of humanity. Who wouldn't want a better human being? Who did they condemn for resisting eugenics? The Catholic Church. We've been here before, friends. We've been here before. Use examples like that with kids. There's a wonderful part of the Jewish Yom Kippur liturgy. Are you ever familiar with Yom Kippur? That's the Jewish Day of Atonement. It's when Jews corporately confess their sins. We go to regular confession individually. In Judaism, it's a corporate practice. And in the service called the Kol Nidre service, and Yom Kippur, the Jewish community gathers and they confess sins corporately. And they go through the list of sins all together, beating their breasts. Has anybody ever been to a Kol Nidre service? No? Okay. Well, here's what happens. All together, vocally, in one voice, they say, "We have lied. We have cheated. We have committed adultery. We have borne false witness against our neighbor." And then they add, we have been zealots for bad causes. There's some serious wisdom there. Serious wisdom. Now, you can't lie accidentally. If you say something that's untrue, but you thought it was true, that's not a lie. You can't cheat someone accidentally. If you pay the wrong price for something and you didn't realize it was the wrong price, you didn't cheat. And when you realize it was the wrong price, you pay whatever more you owe. I don't think you commit adultery by accident. I don't know. But look at, we were zealots for bad causes. No one is ever deliberately a zealot for a bad cause. You're a zealot for the cause because you think it's a good cause. And what that 5,000-year-old tradition recognizes is we can be wrong about that. And if we look at human history, the causes that have been celebrated by the great, the powerful, the noble, those who consider themselves good, the people of goodwill, the enlightened, go right back to eugenics, keep coming back to it, hit it 1,000 times. It was the good people of goodwill who wanted a better human being. Who would want people to suffer? Only bad people would want people to suffer. And now we look at it with horror. You know, the progressive movement only dropped eugenics when the Nazis gave it a bad name. And by the way, just to be clear, the Nazis didn't invent eugenics. They got it from us. It was in America and in Europe, it's true, that the very idea of Lebenswertes Leben, the idea of a life unworthy of life, was created. The Nazis just took it and ran with it. And then once the Nazis discredited it, progressives abandoned it and then pretended that they hadn't had anything to do with it. That's what I love about Tom Leonard's book. He's on the left, by the way, but he's a truth teller. And he tells the truth. And the truth is the progressives, with the best will in the world, were zealots for a very bad cause. And the Catholics, who were accused of being backward and retrograde and anti-science, turn out to be absolutely right. Thank you. Goodbye.